To find out about the population, sample, and sampling characteristics, we'll look at the participants section, which in the case of Burton and King is found on page 154, or page 5 of the PDF. Authors don't always directly tell us the population of interest, so we often need to make an educated guess given what we learned about the purpose of the research. We already have the information about the focus in the worksheet, taken from the section of the article that's in this slide. It doesn't really say anything specific about who they're interested in learning about, so we would assume that their population of interest was people in general. The idea of the recruiting and sampling section of the worksheet is to think about how the researchers got people to participate in the study. In other words, how they collected their sample, and what that means for the type of sampling method they used. APA style usually makes finding information about participant recruiting fairly easy because it's typically included in the participants section, and we know where that's included in the sequence of sections. It's also usually labeled with participants. When you're working with electronic files, you might be able to use the find function to search for the word participants and jump to it pretty easily. That can also help when the journal uses a different style for headings because we frequently use the word participants in describing the sample. When we find the section that should include the information about how they recruited participants, we need to skim to find the specific details. Remember, the idea is that we're trying to figure out how they got people to participate. The authors don't always use phrases exactly like that, but we can usually get the idea. In this case, we get the idea from the phrase about participation in an introductory psychology class. That tells us they contacted participants by making students in that class aware of the study and offering credit for participation. That information, combined with what we already decided about the population, allows us to determine the sampling method. First, we can ask, did this approach allow everyone in the population, in this case all people, to be included? In this case, you're probably saying a pretty strong no, which is accurate and makes it a non-probability sample. Then, we can look at the methods in that category to determine the specific method. Since there isn't any indication they were being purposive, or that they had students ask other students to participate, we would say this is a convenient sample. So this is what you would record in the corresponding section of the worksheet. We can usually find the information about the sample characteristics in the same section where we found the recruitment information. You might have instinctively moved ahead to add that information in your worksheet. The information about how many participants there were, how many of each gender, age, ethnic representation is pretty clearly identified. You'll want to add that to the related sections of the worksheet if you haven't already. The idea behind the other relevant characteristic is that the authors usually tell us something about the sample, other than gender, age, and ethnicity, that seems like would have influenced the findings. In that case, it might also be relatively straightforward. The note about using the health center as a primary source of healthcare. They needed that because of the way they operationalized one of their variables. So now pause this recording to make sure you have your notes about the Burton and King article before you move on to complete the population recruiting and sampling section of the O'Hare and Share worksheet. This one is more specific, still though a little tricky. The first hypothesis refers to young people who were caught breaking university drinking rules. But we might remember that the abstract just refers to young people. Given that, we can make a note that they were definitely interested in young people or they may have been interested in college students who were caught breaking university drinking rules. Hopefully, you found it was fairly easy to find the section with the information about the sampling. I actually had to look up what adjudication process meant, and it looks like it could mean a few things. Think in this context, they're referring to the process students have to go through if they're cited and want to continue as a student and don't want to have something on the record that would keep them from being able to continue later. That said, it looks like they contacted participants by including the study and part of the process required for students who were cited for a rule violation. Although there was some question about the population of interest, it did appear to be larger than students at a single university. Given that, this would be a non-probability sample, because they only collected data from one university. The fact that they only included students who had been cited for a rule violation could have been considered purposive sampling because it appears to have been an intentional way to only include a certain group of people, but would also be accurate to say it was simply a convenient sample. From there, we can go on to add notes about the sample characteristics. Was there anything that stood out to you for the other relevant characteristics section? There might have been a few things. They were all from one school, they were mostly freshmen, most of them lived on campus, and the largest portion was middle class. So to wrap this section up, we might note 3 things. Finding the focus helps us identify the population, and APA style helps finding the information about recruitment, sampling, and the characteristics of the sample. When we're looking at the characteristics of the sample, some information should be relatively standard, but thinking about the focus can help us think about other characteristics that might influence the results.